Sometimes, the most broken people find each other when they need it most. Sometimes, what we buy as a joke becomes the greatest treasure of our lives. In a fading marketplace, Lady Elspeth spots something that breaks her heart. A giant knight, in rusted armor, standing silent beside his loyal donkey. The auctioneer sells them like livestock while nobles laugh and mock. But Elspeth sees dignity in the knight's weathered face. She buys them both on a whim, thinking it's just an expensive jest to annoy the gossips. What she doesn't know is that this broken knight will soon become her salvation. The giant tends her crumbling estate, protects her from greedy neighbors, and slowly becomes her shield in ways she never expected. Through shared silence and understanding, two forgotten souls find something precious together. But who was Sir Garran before his disgrace, and what terrible secret drove him to silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you subscribe, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Dunmere Manor like a shroud, softening the harsh edges of crumbling stone and weathered timber. Lady Elspeth stood at her chamber window, watching the sun struggle through gray clouds that seemed to mirror the weight pressing against her chest. At 43, she had grown accustomed to mornings that began with silence and the hollow echo of her own footsteps in halls that once rang with laughter. She twisted the tarnished gold band on her finger, a habit born of 15 years of widowhood. The ring had grown loose with age and sorrow, sliding easily around skin that had grown pale from too many days spent indoors, away from the judgmental eyes of Dunmere's gossiping nobility. Thomas had slipped it onto her finger when she was barely 18, his eyes bright with dreams of children who would run through these very corridors, of a legacy that would honor the ancient Dunmere name. Those dreams lay buried in the family, crypt alongside her husband, claimed by fever during the harsh winter of their 3rd year of marriage. The ring remained, a constant reminder of promises unfulfilled, and a future that had withered like flowers left too long without water. The estate sprawled before her window like a testament to decline. Once the Dunmere lands had stretched beyond the horizon, fertile fields yielding grain that filled the kingdom's granaries. Now, she could count the productive acres on both hands. The eastern fields lay fallow, choked with weeds that grew higher each season. The western pastures, where prize cattle once grazed, stood empty save for a handful of aging milk cows that barely produced enough for the manor's dwindling household. Dunmere Manor itself bore the scars of her family's diminished fortunes. The roof leaked in 3 places, creating a symphony of drips during rainstorms that echoed through empty rooms she could no longer afford to heat. The great hall, where her grandfather had entertained visiting lords and ladies, now stood shuttered, its massive oak table covered in dust and memories. She had been forced to dismiss half the household staff over the past 5 years, keeping only those who had served the family for decades and refused to leave despite her inability to pay them properly. Martha, the cook who had served Dunmere for 30 years, still prepared meals in the vast kitchen that had once fed scores of guests. Now it felt cavernous and cold, designed for abundance in an age of scarcity. Old Henrik, the groundskeeper, tended what gardens he could manage alone, his arthritic hands moving slowly among roses that grew wild and untamed without proper care. Young Tom, the stable boy who was no longer young at 28, cared for the 3 remaining horses with the devotion of a man who understood that each animal represented a piece of the estate's fading soul. The servants whispered, of course. Elspeth heard their murmured conversations that ceased abruptly when she entered a room. They spoke of creditors who arrived with increasing frequency, their polite smiles barely concealing the hunger in their eyes as they assessed the value of tapestries and silverware. They discussed the neighboring lords who had begun making subtle inquiries about purchasing Dunmere lands, their offers growing bolder as her situation became more desperate. Lord Aldrich of Ravenshollow had been particularly persistent, his visits becoming more frequent and his manner more presumptuous with each encounter. A man of perhaps 50 years, with calculating gray eyes and hands soft from a life of taking rather than building. He represented everything Elspeth had come to despise about the changing world. He spoke of progress and efficiency, of consolidating smaller estates into more profitable ventures. But his words carried the cold pragmatism of a man who saw opportunity in others' misfortune. "Lady Elspeth," he had said during his last visit, his voice carrying false warmth as he studied the faded tapestries adorning the receiving room walls. "A woman in your position must think practically about the future. The manor requires investments you cannot afford, and the lands need management beyond your current capabilities." She had offered him tea with steady hands, though inside she burned with the humiliation of his casual dismissal of her abilities. "The estate has been in my family for 7 generations, Lord Aldrich. I have no intention of selling." "Of course not," he had replied, his smile never wavering as his eyes catalogued the cracks in the plaster and the worn patches in the Persian rug beneath his feet. "But sentiment, admirable as it may be, does not repair roofs or pay servants' wages." That conversation had taken place 3 weeks ago, and his words haunted her quiet moments. The truth of his assessment stung because it reflected her own secret fears. She was failing Thomas's memory, failing her ancestors who had built this estate through generations of sacrifice, failing the servants who depended on her for their livelihoods. Yet something stubborn in her nature refused to surrender. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was the last flicker of the spirited girl who had once believed she could conquer the world with love and determination. She had taken to attending local auctions and markets, partly to find bargains that might stretch her meager resources, but mostly to escape the suffocating weight of the manor's declining grandeur. The servants found her behavior eccentric. Widowed ladies of noble birth were expected to retreat into dignified obscurity, managing their households quietly while wearing black and cultivating an air of tragic refinement. They were not supposed to wander through common markets, haggling with merchants over the price of grain or bidding on household items alongside farmers' wives and tradesmen. But Elspeth had discovered something liberating in these excursions. Among the common folk, she was judged not by her bloodline or her husband's legacy, but by her fairness in trade and her willingness to treat everyone with respect. The baker's wife shared gossip and recipes without calculating what advantage might be gained. The wool merchant offered honest prices without the condescending smile she received from suppliers who delivered to the manor dot. It was this growing reputation for eccentricity that made yesterday's auction purchase seem less shocking. To those who knew her, the traveling auctioneer's curiosities had drawn a crowd of nobles, seeking entertainment, and commoners, hoping for practical bargains. Among the usual collection of household goods and farm implements, the sight of a giant knight in rusted armor had created quite a sensation. She could still hear Lord Aldrich's mocking laughter, the way he had leaned toward his companions and whispered loud enough for half the crowd to hear. Perhaps the knight can protect her from her creditors where her late husband's debts could not. The cruelty of the comment had struck her like a physical blow, but it had also ignited something fierce within her spirit. When the auctioneer had called for bids on the curiosity from bygone days, she had raised her hand without conscious thought, driven by an impulse that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than rational decision-making. The other bidders had quickly withdrawn, perhaps sensing that her determination ran deeper than mere amusement. The final price, 50 silver pieces, represented a significant portion of her remaining reserves, money she should have saved for winter provisions or urgent repairs. Yet, as she had counted out the coins, she felt no regret, only a strange sense of rightness that defied logical explanation. Now, in the gray light of morning, she wondered what madness had possessed her. The knight and his donkey would arrive today, and she had no clear idea what she intended to do with them. Feed them. Certainly, her mother had raised her to treat all guests with proper hospitality, even those acquired through impulse at country auctions. Beyond that basic courtesy, she felt adrift in uncertainty. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "My lady?" Martha's voice carried the familiar tone of patient concern that had comforted Elspeth through countless dark mornings. "The morning meal is prepared, and Henrik wishes to speak with you about the night's accommodations." Elspeth turned from the window, squaring her shoulders in a gesture that had become habitual whenever she faced the day's challenges. "Of course, Martha. I'll be down directly." As she prepared to leave her chamber, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror that had belonged to her mother. The reflection showed a woman who had aged beyond her years, her dark hair streaked with premature silver, and her blue eyes shadowed with worries that seemed to multiply with each passing season. Yet something in her expression suggested that beneath the weight of responsibility and loss, the spirit that had once attracted Thomas's devotion still flickered, waiting for the right moment to blaze bright again. She did not yet understand that yesterday's impulsive purchase would prove to be that moment, or that the mysterious knight now traveling toward Dunmere Manor carried within his silent presence the power to restore not only her faith in others, but her faith in herself. All she knew was that change was coming, and for the first time in years, the prospect filled her with anticipation rather than dread. The sound of approaching wheels on gravel announced their arrival just as the afternoon sun broke through the persistent morning clouds. Elspeth stood in the manor's main courtyard, her hands clasped tightly before her as she watched a simple farm cart round the bend in the drive. Her heart quickened with an emotion she couldn't quite identify, anticipation mixed with apprehension, curiosity tempered by the growing realization that she had purchased two living beings, without any clear plan for their care. The cart driver, a weathered man with kind eyes and calloused hands, pulled his horses to a gentle stop near the manor's front steps. "Lady Elspeth," he called, touching his cap respectfully. "I've brought your knight and his companion, as arranged." The knight sat perfectly still in the cart's bed, his massive frame somehow managing to appear both imposing and utterly resigned. In daylight, away from the auction's theatrical atmosphere, Sir Garran looked even more like a relic from another age. His armor, though rusted and dented, had been crafted by master smiths. She could see that even through the accumulated wear of years. Each piece showed evidence of meticulous maintenance despite its age, suggesting that beneath the surface, decay lay a foundation of enduring quality. His donkey stood tethered to the cart's side, a patient creature with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that spoke of careful grooming despite their circumstances. The animal's calm demeanor suggested a temperament suited to its current situation, neither skittish nor aggressive, simply accepting whatever fate awaited. But it was the knight himself who commanded Elspeth's attention. Even seated and motionless, he radiated a presence that spoke of strength held in careful check. His face, weathered by sun and hardship, bore the kind of lines that came from squinting into distant horizons and making difficult decisions under pressure. His gray-streaked beard was neatly trimmed, and his hair, though in need of washing, had been pulled back with military precision. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue and startlingly clear. They held depths that suggested both profound sadness and unshakable dignity. When their gazes met, she felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with familiarity and everything to do with understanding. Here was someone who had carried burdens too heavy for most shoulders, who had learned to endure without complaint, who had maintained honor in circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. "Thank you for bringing them," she told the cart driver, pressing a silver coin into his palm. "Please, take some refreshment before you begin your return journey." The man nodded gratefully and accepted Martha's offer of bread and ale, but his eyes kept drifting toward the silent knight with obvious curiosity. It occurred to Elspeth that her purchase would be the subject of tavern conversation for weeks to come. adding another layer to her reputation for eccentricity. Sir Garran rose from the cart with fluid grace that belied his size, his movements economical and precise. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders and powerful build suggesting a lifetime of physical labor and combat training. Yet there was nothing threatening in his demeanor. Rather, he carried himself with the careful awareness of someone who understood his own strength and chose to wield it responsibly. He approached Elspeth with measured steps, stopping at a respectful distance before inclining his head in a formal bow that spoke of noble breeding despite his current circumstances. The gesture held such dignity that she found herself responding with a curtsy more elaborate than she had offered to visiting lords. "Sir Garran," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised her. "Welcome to Dunmere Manor." He acknowledged her greeting with another slight nod, but remained silent, his pale eyes studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. She sensed that he was taking her measure not as a curiosity or potential threat, but as someone whose character would determine how their strange arrangement would unfold. His donkey approached at a leisurely pace, showing none of the wariness that might be expected from an animal in unfamiliar surroundings. Instead, the creature seemed genuinely curious about its new environment, ears forward and eyes bright with interest. When it reached Elspeth, it extended its neck toward her in a gesture that seemed almost like a formal introduction. "And what shall I call you, gentle friend?" she asked, reaching out to stroke the soft fur between the donkey's ears. The animal leaned into her touch with obvious pleasure, and she felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. Henrik appeared from the direction of the stables, his weathered face creased with concern. "My lady, I've prepared the old groom's quarters above the stable, if that meets with your approval. There's hay fresh laid for the donkey, and the water trough has been cleaned." Elspeth glanced at Sir Garran, trying to gauge his reaction to these arrangements. His expression remained impassive, but she thought she detected a slight relaxation in his posture that suggested the accommodations were acceptable. The old groom's quarters had been empty for 3 years, since the last of their stable staff had departed for better prospects elsewhere. The rooms were simple but clean, with a small hearth and a narrow window that looked out over the estate's eastern fields. "That sounds perfect, Henrik. Thank you for your thoughtfulness." She turned back to the knight. "I hope you'll find the quarters comfortable. Please, make yourself at home and let us know if you require anything." Sir Garran's response was to bow again, this time with a slight gesture toward the donkey that seemed to include his companion in the thanks. Then, with the same fluid grace he had shown in dismounting from the cart, he gathered the donkey's lead rope and began walking toward the stables, his long strides covering ground efficiently without appearing hurried. Young Tom emerged from the stable to greet them, his face bright with excitement at the prospect of new charges to care for. "Sir Knight, I've prepared the finest stall for your companion, with fresh straw and oats from our best stores." The knight paused and placed a gentle hand on Tom's shoulder, the gesture conveying gratitude more eloquently than words might have managed. Then he continued toward the stable, the donkey following with the easy confidence of long partnership. "Odd sort, isn't he?" Martha observed, appearing at Elspeth's side with the quiet efficiency that had made her invaluable through all the years of the estate's decline. "Not what you'd expect from someone sold at auction like common livestock." "No," Elspeth agreed, watching the knight's retreating figure. "Not common at all." As evening approached, she found herself drawn repeatedly to windows that offer views of the stable yard. Sir Garran had settled into the rhythm of estate life with surprising ease, helping Tom with the evening feeding and demonstrating a gentle competence with all the animals that spoke of long experience. His movements were economical and purposeful, never wasted, always directed towards some useful end. Most remarkably, the other animals seemed to accept his presence without question. The horses, who could be skittish around strangers, stood calmly, while he checked their hooves and adjusted their blankets. The milk cows, notorious for their stubborn independence, actually approached him willingly, as if sensing something trustworthy in his quiet manner. When Henrik mentioned that the knight had spent the afternoon repairing a section of paddock fence that had been damaged in the last storm, Elspeth felt a flutter of something that might have been gratitude or might have been something more complex. She had not asked him to perform such work, had not even mentioned the fence's poor condition. Yet he had seen the need and addressed it without fanfare or expectation of praise. That night, as she prepared for bed, she found herself thinking, not about the day's correspondence from creditors or the approaching harvest that would likely yield less than needed, but about the quiet dignity of the man now sleeping in her stable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties, but for the first time in months, she felt that she was not facing them entirely alone. The night's silence, which should have been unsettling, somehow felt like a form of respect rather than rejection. He was waiting, she realized, giving her time to adjust to his presence, allowing their strange arrangement to develop naturally rather than forcing premature intimacy or demanding immediate definition of their relationship. As sleep finally claimed her, Lady Elspeth's last conscious thought was that her impulsive purchase might prove to be less foolish than everyone assumed. The broken sword hilt she had glimpsed at his side spoke of a warrior's past, but the gentle hands that had soothed her animals suggested a man who understood that true strength often lay in restraint rather than action. Dawn came softly to Dunmere Manor, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Elspeth of happier mornings when Thomas would wake her with gentle kisses and whisper plans for the day ahead. She had risen early, drawn by restless energy that seemed to pulse through her veins like wine, and now stood at her chamber window, watching the estate come to life beneath Sir Garran's quiet influence. The knight had begun his work before sunrise, moving through the grounds with the purposeful efficiency of a man accustomed to making the most of daylight hours. From her elevated vantage point, she could see him examining the manor's foundation stones, running his hands along the ancient granite blocks that bore her family's Cresta oak, tree with roots that spread wide and branches that reached toward heaven. The cornerstone, she knew, bore the deepest crack, a fissure that had appeared 3 winters ago during a particularly harsh freeze. The stonemason she had consulted had quoted repairs costs that exceeded her entire annual income, forcing her to accept the damage as another symbol of the estate's gradual decay. Yet Sir Garran studied the crack with the attention of someone who saw possibility rather than defeat, his fingers tracing the stone surface as if reading a language written in granite and time. "My lady?" Martha's voice interrupted her observations. "Young Tom says the knight has asked for tools and mortar. Shall I have Henrik provide them?" Elspeth turned from the window, her heart quickening with an emotion she was reluctant to examine too closely. "Of course. Give him whatever he requires." "Begging your pardon, my lady, but should we not discuss wages first? A man of his obvious skills." "He has not asked for wages," Elspeth replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "I will not insult him by assuming he works only for coin." Martha's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded with the wisdom of someone who had served the family long enough to recognize when further discussion would be unwelcome. After the cook departed, Elspeth found herself drawn back to the window, unable to resist watching the knight's methodical approach to problems that had seemed insurmountable just days before. By mid-morning, Sir Garran had gathered what materials the estate could provide and begun the delicate work of repointing the foundation stones. His movements were precise and economical, each gesture serving a purpose, nothing wasted on showmanship or unnecessary flourish. She had expected him to work with the rough efficiency of a laborer, But instead he approached the task with the careful attention of a craftsman who understood that proper foundation work required patience and skill. Henrik approached the knight, periodically offering assistance or advice gained from decades of maintaining the estate's buildings. Elspeth watched these interactions with growing fascination, noting how Sir Garran listened intently to the older man's suggestions while contributing insights that spoke of experience with both construction and defensive fortification. There, communication relied heavily on gestures and shared understanding, yet seemed more effective than many conversations she had witnessed between men who talked endlessly without saying anything meaningful. As the days passed, a routine emerged that felt both strange and oddly comforting. Sir Garran would rise before dawn, spending the early hours in what appeared to be a combination of prayer and physical exercise in the stable yard. His movements during these sessions were fluid and controlled, bearing resemblance to both combat training and meditative practice. Watching from her window, Elspeth found herself entranced by the careful precision of his form, the way he seemed to flow from one position to another like water finding its proper course. After his morning routine, the knight would survey the estate with the systematic thoroughness of a military commander assessing defensive positions. He walked every path, examined every structure, tested every gate and door with the attention of someone who understood that small problems ignored could become large problems that threatened everything worth protecting. His reports to Henrik took the form of quietly pointing out issues that required attention, always accompanied by practical suggestions for addressing them. The estate's animals had accepted him completely, drawn by an instinctive recognition of his gentle authority. The horses stood calmly for his inspection, allowing him to check their hooves and coats with the competence of someone who understood that a warrior's life often depended on his mount's condition. The milk cows, notorious for their stubborn independence, actually sought his attention, pressing against the fence when he passed, as if hoping for the reassurance of his steady presence. Most remarkably, the estate's working rhythm seemed to improve under his quiet influence. Tom worked with renewed enthusiasm, eager to learn from someone whose knowledge of horses and animal husbandry clearly exceeded his own. Henrik moved with less obvious pain, as if the knight's willingness to handle the heavier tasks had given the older man permission to acknowledge his limitations without shame. Even Martha, initially skeptical of the strange addition to their household, began to speak of Sir Garran with grudging respect. "Never seen anyone work stone like that," she confided to Elspeth over the evening meal. "Uses his hands like they're thinking independent of his head, if you understand my meaning." Elspeth understood perfectly. She had spent hours watching those hands work, noting their careful strength and surprising delicacy. When Sir Garran worked with mortar, his fingers shaped and smoothed the material with the same attention an artist might give to clay. When he handled tools, they seemed to become extensions of his body rather than separate implements requiring conscious control. But it was his interactions with the estate's more vulnerable residents that touched her most deeply. The barn cats, half-wild creatures that typically fled from human contact, had begun following him during his rounds, somehow sensing that his presence meant safety rather than threat. When he discovered a nest of orphaned kittens in the hay loft, he had spent an entire afternoon fashioning a comfortable shelter and establishing a feeding routine that would ensure their survival. His donkey, meanwhile, had settled into estate life with the contentment of a creature that had finally found its proper home. The animal followed Sir Garran during his work when possible, but seemed equally happy to graze in the paddock or accept attention from Tom and Henrik. Its calm presence had a soothing effect on the other animals, as if its acceptance of the situation provided reassurance that all was well as the first week of Sir Garran's residence drew to a close. Elspeth found herself anticipating each day's observations with an eagerness that surprised her. She had grown accustomed to mornings that began with anxiety about pressing problems and ended with exhaustion from battles that could not be won. Now, she woke thinking about what improvements the knight might have planned, what small crisis he might quietly resolve through applied competence and unwavering dedication. The change in her own routine did not go unnoticed by her servants. Martha commented on her improved appetite, and Henrik mentioned that she seemed to spend less time in the estate's account books and more time walking the grounds. Young Tom, with the directness of youth, had observed that she smiled more frequently, and that her laughter, when it came, sounded less forced than it had in recent months. Yet even as she acknowledged the positive changes in her daily life, Elspeth found herself wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Sir Garran's competence and dedication were evident, but his motives remained mysterious. He worked without being asked, accepted no payment beyond basic shelter and meals, and maintained his silence even when circumstances might have justified explanation or at least acknowledgement of his efforts. The mystery of his past hung between them like a curtain that neither seemed willing to draw aside. She had seen enough to know that he possessed skills suggesting noble birth and military training. Yet he had somehow fallen so far from grace that he could be sold at auction like livestock. The broken sword hilt at his side spoke of battles fought and perhaps lost, while his bearing suggested honor that circumstances had tested but not destroyed. Standing at her window as another day ended, watching Sir Garran complete his evening routine with the same careful attention he brought to every task, Lady Elspeth realized that her impulsive purchase had accomplished something she had not expected. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly curious about the future rather than simply resigned to enduring it. Whatever had brought this mysterious knight to her estate, whatever forces had reduced him to being sold at auction, she found herself hoping that Dunmere Manor might provide him with the same sense of purpose and belonging that his presence had begun to restore to her own life. The worn leather glove lay forgotten on the garden wall, where Sir Garran had placed it while examining the climbing roses that had grown wild in recent years. Elspeth discovered it during her morning walk, the supple hide warm from the sun and bearing the honest stains of recent labor. She lifted it carefully, noting how the leather had been shaped by years of use, molded to hands that had wielded both sword and plow with equal competence. Something about holding his glove felt intensely personal, as if she were touching a part of the man himself rather than merely an article of his clothing. The leather was surprisingly soft, despite its obvious age, suggesting that its owner had taken care to maintain it even when other possessions had been lost or abandoned. She found herself tracing the worn seams with her fingertip, wondering about the hands that had shaped this simple tool into something that spoke of both strength and gentleness. "Lady Elspeth?" Sir Garran's voice, though rarely heard, carried a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate through her bones when he chose to speak. She turned to find him approaching from the direction of the stables, his other gloves still in place, his pale eyes focused on the item in her hands with an expression that might have been embarrassment. "I was just admiring the craftsmanship," she said, extending the glove toward him. "The leather is beautifully maintained." He accepted the glove with a slight bow, their fingers brushing briefly during the exchange. The contact lasted only a moment, but she felt the callous strength of his hands and the surprising warmth of his skin. When he stepped back, she noticed that he had colored slightly, as if their brief touch had affected him as profoundly as it had affected her. "The roses need attention," he said quietly, his first words to her beyond simple acknowledgments and expressions of thanks. His voice held the cultured tones of noble breeding despite his current circumstances, confirming her growing suspicions about his background. "They were my mother's pride," she replied, grateful for a safe topic that might encourage him to continue speaking. She spent hours training them up the south wall, claiming that proper roses required both firmness and patience. Something in his expression shifted at her words, a flicker of what might have been recognition or shared understanding. "Wise advice," he said, pulling on the recovered glove with practiced efficiency, "for roses and other growing things." The conversation lasted only moments, but it marked a subtle change in their relationship. Over the following days, Sir Garran began to speak more frequently, though his words were always carefully chosen and directed toward practical matters. He would ask Henrik about the estate's history, inquire about the soil conditions in various fields, or seek Martha's advice about which areas of the manor required the most urgent attention. But it was during their encounters in the garden that Elspeth began to glimpse the man beneath the mysterious silence. She had taken to spending her mornings among the flower beds, partly to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the manor's increasingly empty rooms, but mostly because she knew Sir Garran spent his early hours working in the grounds. Their conversations began as simple exchanges about gardening techniques, but gradually evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. "The climbing roses respond well to careful pruning," he observed one morning, demonstrating the proper angle for cutting with movements that spoke of long practice. "Remove the dead wood, shape the growth, but never cut so drastically that you destroy the plant's natural vigor. You seem to know a great deal about gardening for a—" She stopped herself before completing the thought, realizing that she had no idea what his previous life had entailed beyond the obvious military training. "For a knight sold at auction?" He finished quietly, a hint of gentle humor in his voice. "A warrior's education includes many subjects that might surprise those who think only of swords and battles." His words carried no bitterness, only a kind of resigned acceptance that made her heart ache with sympathy for whatever circumstances had brought him to such reduced situation. She wanted to ask about his past, to understand the forces that had shaped him into this complex man who wielded pruning shears with the same competence he had once brought to weapons of war. Instead, she found herself sharing memories of her own past, stories of her mother's gardening philosophy and her father's belief that a true estate was measured not by its wealth, but by the care lavished on every growing thing within its boundaries. Sir Garran listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that personal stories were precious gifts not to be accepted lightly. As the days lengthened into weeks, she began to notice subtle changes in herself that went beyond the improved estate management. She woke each morning with anticipation rather than dread, eager to discover what small miracle of organization or repair Sir Garran might have accomplished during the night hours when sleep eluded him. Her appetite had returned, encouraged by Martha's increasingly elaborate meals prepared for a household that now included someone worthy of the cook's finest efforts. More significantly, she found herself caring about her appearance in ways that had nothing to do with maintaining proper dignity for an impoverished widow. She spent more time arranging her hair, chose her gowns with greater attention to color and fit, and even asked Martha to alter a dress that had grown loose during the months when grief and worry had stolen her appetite. The change did not escape notice from the estate's other residents. Tom had begun whistling while he worked, his youthful energy renewed by having someone whose knowledge and experience he could admire without reservation. Henrik moved with less obvious pain, his arthritis seeming to improve now that the heaviest tasks were shared with younger, stronger hands. Even the animals reflected the improved atmosphere. The horses stood prouder in their stalls, their coats gleaming from increased attention. The milk cows produced more abundantly, as if responding to the general sense of hope that seemed to permeate the estate's daily routines. But it was the growing intimacy of her interactions with Sir Garran that occupied most of Elspeth's thoughts. During quiet moments, their conversations had evolved beyond practical matters to include discussions of philosophy, observations about human nature, and shared appreciation for the simple beauties that surrounded them. He proved to be well-educated and thoughtful, with opinions shaped by experiences that it clearly included both triumph and devastating loss. Beauty persists even in decline, he had said one evening as they stood together watching the sunset. Paint the manor's weathered stones in shades of gold and rose. Perhaps especially in decline, when we learn to value what remains rather than mourn what has been lost. His words had been spoken while looking at the manor, but something in his tone suggested deeper meanings than applied to more than architecture. She had felt his gaze shift to her face during the silence that followed, a look so intense and tender that her breath had caught in her throat. The growing attraction between them remained unspoken, but increasingly obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Martha had begun humming while she worked, a sure sign that the cook approved of developments she was too tactful to discuss openly. Henrik had started deferring to Sir Garran's judgment on matters of estate management with the respect accorded to an equal rather than a temporary resident. Yet even as she acknowledged her growing feelings, Elspeth found herself troubled by the gulf that separated their circumstances. She was, despite her reduced fortunes, still Lady of Dunmere, bearing an ancient name and holding legal title to lands that had been in her family for generations. He was a man without acknowledged position, possessing neither property nor official identity beyond what she had purchased at a country auction. The practical implications of such a relationship seemed insurmountable, yet her heart refused to accept the logical obstacles that her mind presented. When she watched him work in the garden, his strong hands gentle with growing things, she felt a stirring of emotions that had nothing to do with social propriety or family expectations. When their eyes met across the dinner table during the simple meals they had begun sharing, she saw something in his expression that suggested her feelings were not unreciprocated. As another day ended and she prepared to retire to chambers that no longer felt quite so empty, Lady Elspeth realized that her impulsive purchase had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. The mysterious night had become essential to the estate's improved functioning, but more importantly, he had become essential to her own sense of completeness in ways that both thrilled and terrified. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and uncertainties. But for tonight she was content to hold the memory of his gentle hands among the roses, and the sound of his rarely heard laughter when Tom had told a particularly amusing story about the donkey's morning adventures. Whatever the future might hold, she no longer felt that she was facing it entirely alone. The ancient oak stood sentinel at the heart of Dunmere's grounds, its massive trunk scarred by centuries of storms, yet somehow strengthened by each trial. It had endured. Elspeth had discovered Sir Garran there during the quiet hour before dawn, seated against the tree's broad base with his eyes closed and his breathing deep and measured. She had not meant to disturb his solitude, but something about his stillness beneath the spreading branches had drawn her closer despite her better judgment. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said softly, careful not to startle him from what appeared to be either prayer or meditation. His eyes opened slowly, those pale blue depths focusing on her with the gradual awareness of someone returning from a great distance. "Not at all, my lady. The tree belongs to all who find comfort in its presence." She settled beside him on the soft grass, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, but not so close as to seem forward. The oak's canopy filtered the early morning light into patterns that danced across their faces, creating an intimate space that felt separate from the rest of the world. "My father planted this tree the year I was born," she said, running her hand across the rough bark. "He claimed it would grow strong enough to shelter generations of our family, that its roots would grow deep enough to anchor the estate through any storm. Wise trees choose their ground carefully," Sir Garran replied, his voice carrying the thoughtful tone she had come to associate with his more philosophical observations. "They know that survival depends not just on reaching toward the light, but on establishing foundations that cannot be easily disturbed." Something in his words suggested he was speaking about more than trees, and she found herself studying his profile as he gazed up into the spreading branches. The morning light revealed details she had not noticed before, the small scar along his jaw that spoke of old violence, the way his hands rested with unconscious readiness even in moments of apparent relaxation, the careful way he held himself as if expecting to need to move quickly at any moment. "You understand trees better than most gardeners I've known," she observed, hoping to encourage him to continue speaking. His words always carried layers of meaning that intrigued her, as if he possessed insights earned through experiences she could only imagine. "I've had time to observe their wisdom," he said simply. "Trees teach patience to those willing to learn. They show us that strength often comes from bending rather than breaking, that the deepest roots grow in darkness where no one can see their progress." They sat in comfortable silence as the estate awakened around them. Tom's cheerful whistling drifted from the stables, followed by Henrik's voice calling instructions about the day's work. Martha's kitchen chimney began producing the steady stream of smoke that announced breakfast preparations. The familiar sounds of daily routine created a backdrop of domestic peace that made their shared solitude feel both precious and natural. "Sir Garran," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to voice the question that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "Forgive me if I presume too much, but I sense that you carry burdens that go beyond whatever circumstances brought you to the auction." His stillness became more profound, as if her words had touched something he had been guarding carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made her chest tighten with sympathy. "We all carry burdens, my lady. Some are visible, some are not. Some can be shared, others must be borne alone. But surely sharing them lightens the load, even if only slightly." He turned to look at her directly, his pale eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "And what if sharing them places others in danger? What if the burdens we carry are meant to protect those we—" He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself before revealing more than he intended. "Those we care about?" she finished softly, her heart racing at the implications of his unfinished sentence. The silence that followed seemed to pulse with unspoken emotions and possibilities. She could see the internal struggle in his expression, the war between a desire to confide and what appeared to be deeply ingrained caution. When he finally spoke, his words carried the careful precision of someone choosing each phrase with extreme care. "I have learned that sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to remain silent about truths that could harm innocent people. There are secrets that protect and secrets that destroy. A wise man learns to distinguish between them." "And which kind of secrets do you carry?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "The kind that have kept me alive when others were not so fortunate," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The kind that ensure I will never be welcomed back into the world I once knew, but that allow me to sleep, knowing I have not betrayed those who trusted me." The pain in his voice was so evident that she acted on pure instinct, reaching out to cover his hand with her own. The contact sent warmth racing up her arm, but more importantly, she felt some of the tension leave his body at her touch. "Whatever you have done or failed to do," she said firmly, "whatever brought you to that auction, I cannot believe you are a man without honor. Everything I have observed tells me otherwise." His hand turned beneath hers, their fingers intertwining, with a naturalness that surprised them both. "Your faith honors me more than you know, my lady. But faith and truth are not always the same thing." "Then tell me the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Help me understand what shadows you're carrying, what dangers you fear might touch those around you." For a moment, she thought he might actually confide in her. His grip on her hand tightened, and she could see him wrestling with the decision. But then something shifted in his expression, a curtain falling across his features that shut her out as effectively as a slammed door. "The truth is that some questions are better left unasked," he said, gently extracting his hand from hers. "Some stories are too dangerous in the telling. The rejection stung more than she had expected, but she forced herself to accept it with as much grace as she could manage. "I understand, but please know that whatever demons you're fighting, you don't have to fight them entirely alone. This estate has weathered many storms. Perhaps it's strong enough to weather one more." He rose with his characteristic fluid grace, brushing grass from his clothing with movements that seemed designed to give him time to compose himself. While he looked down at her, his expression had returned to the careful neutrality she had grown accustomed to, but she thought she detected a flicker of gratitude in his pale eyes. "You are kinder than I deserve, Lady Elspeth. More generous than wisdom would recommend." "Wisdom is overrated," she replied, attempting to lighten the mood despite the emotional weight of their conversation. "I've found that kindness often succeeds where wisdom fails." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at her words. Perhaps that is the wisest observation of all. As he walked away toward the day's duties, she remained beneath the oak's protective canopy, her mind churning with questions and possibilities. The conversation had revealed more about his character than any direct confession might have managed. Here was a man who placed others' safety above his own comfort, who carried secrets not from selfishness but from a misguided sense of protection. The growing intimacy between them was undeniable, but so was the wall he had constructed around his past. Whatever forces had brought him to the auction, whatever sins real or imagined he believed he had committed, they stood between them like a chasm that her affection alone could not bridge. Yet as she rose and prepared to face another day of estate management and social obligations, Lady Elspeth found herself more determined than ever to find a way around his defenses. The man who worked her gardens with such gentle competence, who treated her servants with unfailing respect, who had brought peace and purpose back to Dunmere Manor. Such a man deserved more than exile and silence. Under the spreading branches of the oak that had sheltered her family for decades, she made a silent promise to herself and to him. Whatever shadows from his past threatened their growing happiness, she would face them at his side. The tree had taught her that the deepest roots grew in darkness, and perhaps it was time for both of them to stop hiding from the light. The hand-carved wooden bird rested in the palm of her hand like a captured song, its delicate features rendered with such artistry that she could almost imagine it taking flight. Elspeth had discovered it on the garden wall during her evening walk, left there either by accident or designed by the man who had occupied her thoughts with increasing frequency as autumn settled over Dunmere Manor. The carving was exquisite in its simplicity, a small robin with wings slightly spread as if caught in the moment before launching itself skyward. Every feather had been suggested with the most delicate of cuts, each line flowing naturally into the next with the confidence of someone who understood both wood and the creatures that inspired his art. The wood itself had been polished to a warm glow that invited touch, its surface smooth beneath her fingers. "It's beautiful," she said softly when Sir Garran appeared from the direction of the stables, his approach so quiet she might not have noticed him if she had not been half expecting his presence. He stopped a respectful distance away, his pale eyes focusing on the carving in her hands with an expression that might have been embarrassment. "The idle habit from evening hours. I had not meant to leave it where you might find it." "Then I'm grateful for your forgetfulness," she replied, studying the bird's perfectly proportioned form. "This level of skill suggests years of practice. When did you learn to work wood with such artistry?" "Long ago," he said simply, stepping closer at her gesture of invitation. "During seasons when a warrior's skills were not required, when there was time for gentler pursuits." The admission revealed another layer of the complex man who had become so essential to her daily happiness. She had grown accustomed to discovering hidden depths in his character, his knowledge of horses and healing herbs, his understanding of defensive architecture, his surprising familiarity with poetry and philosophy. But this evidence of artistic sensitivity touched her differently, suggesting a soul that had found beauty even in circumstances that might have hardened other hearts. "May I keep it?" she asked, cradled the small robin against her chest. "I promise to treasure it properly." Something in his expression shifted at her words, a warmth that transformed his usually guarded features into something approaching true happiness. "It would honor me to know you found pleasure in such a simple thing." Their evening routine had evolved over the past weeks into something that felt both natural and precious. After the day's work was complete and the evening meal had been shared with Martha, Henrik, and Tom, she and Sir Garran would walk the estate grounds together, their conversations ranging from practical matters to philosophical observations that revealed the educated mind beneath his humble circumstances. These walks had become the highlights of her days, moments of companionship that filled the emptiness that had plagued her since Thomas's death. Sir Garran proved to be an engaging conversationalist when he chose to speak, his words carrying the weight of experience and reflection. More importantly, he listened with the focused attention of someone who valued her thoughts and opinions, treating her insights with the respect she had rarely received from other men of her acquaintance. "The estate looks different now," she observed as they paused near the rebuilt paddock fence that stood straight and strong under his careful attention. "More like the place I remember from childhood, when everything seemed possible and nothing was beyond repair." "Good foundations make everything else achievable," he replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of work well done. "Your estate was built by people who understood that quality endures long after expedience fails." She found herself studying his profile in the gathering dusk, noting the way the fading light emphasized the clean lines of his jaw and the aristocratic cast of his features. Whatever circumstances had reduced him to being sold at auction, they had not been able to erase the evidence of noble breeding that showed in his bearing and speech. "Sir Garran," she began, then hesitated as she always did when approaching topics that might touch on his mysterious past. "Forgive my presumption, but your knowledge and abilities suggest education and training that go far beyond what most men acquire. I cannot help wondering what life you lived before I became chattel to be sold at country auctions," he finished quietly, his tone carrying no bitterness, but rather a kind of resigned acceptance that made her heart ache. "Before you found your way to Dunmere," she corrected gently. "Whatever brought you here, I am grateful for it. This estate has become something it had not been in years, a place of purpose and hope rather than mere survival." They had stopped, walking without conscious decision, standing now in the shadow of the oak tree that had become their informal meeting place. The familiar setting seemed to encourage confidences, as if the ancient tree's presence made their conversation feel protected from outside judgment. "You give me more credit than I deserve," he said, his voice so soft she had to lean closer to hear his words. "I am simply a man trying to prove that some things are worth preserving, that honor and loyalty still have meaning even when the world seems determined to abandon such concepts." "And what have you preserved through your efforts here?" she asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on what had been accomplished. He was quiet for so long that she wondered if he intended to answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried a vulnerability that took her breath away. "Perhaps I have preserved the possibility that I might deserve the faith you have shown in me. Perhaps I have proven to myself that these hands can build as well as destroy, that this life might have purposes beyond the ones I once served." The raw honesty in his voice stirred emotions in her chest that she had not felt since Thomas's death. A combination of protectiveness and tender affection that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with growing love. She reached out to touch his arm, needing the physical connection to anchor the intensity of her feelings. "You have given me back my home," she said simply. "More than that, you have given me back hope. Whatever you once were, whatever you think, you have done or failed to do, you have been a blessing to this estate and to me." His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his calloused fingers gentle against her softer skin. Lady Elspeth, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words that would not come. What is it? She asked, stepping closer despite the voice of propriety that whispered warnings about appropriate behavior for a widow of noble birth. I fear that my presence here may not be the blessing you believe it to be, he said finally, his pale eyes reflecting a pain that seemed to come from someplace deep within his soul. There are aspects of my past that could bring danger to you and to everyone who has shown me kindness. My silence is not meant to exclude you, but to protect you. From what? She asked, though part of her feared the answer even as her heart insisted she needed to know. From enemies who would not hesitate to use innocent people to achieve their goals. From political forces that see honor as weakness and loyalty as something to be exploited. From the consequences of choices I made in service to ideals that proved less pure than I had believed. His words painted a picture of intrigue and betrayal that seemed to belong to a different world from the peaceful estate they had been rebuilding together. Yet she could see the truth of his fears in his expression, the weight of knowledge that had been bearing down on him throughout their time together. Do you think I am so fragile that I cannot face whatever challenges your past might bring? She asked, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Do you think this estate has not weathered storms before, that we who live here are incapable of standing together against outside threats? I think you are braver than wisdom would recommend, he replied, echoing her own words from their conversation beneath the oak. I think your compassion may blind you to dangers that experience has taught me to recognize. Then help me see them clearly, she said, moving closer until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her face. Trust me with the truth you have been carrying alone. Let me decide whether the risk is worth taking. For a moment, she thought he might actually confide in her completely. His free hand rose to cup her cheek with a tenderness that made her knees weak, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent care. In his pale eyes, she could see the war between desire and duty, between the longing to share his burdens and the fear of what that sharing might cost. But then, as had happened before, caution won over courage. His hands dropped to his sides, and he stepped back, putting physical distance between them that felt like an emotional chasm. Some truths are too dangerous for sharing, he said, his voice carefully controlled but carrying an undertone of regret that told her the withdrawal cost him as much as it did her. Some stories are better left untold, especially when they might endanger those we. Again, he stopped before completing the thought. Those we love? She finished, her heart racing at the implications of the word he had not quite spoken. The silence that followed stretched between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. She could see the answer in his eyes, could read the truth he was too honorable to speak while believing himself unworthy of her affection. But she could also see the walls he had built around his heart, the defenses that her growing love had not yet been able to breach. As they walked back toward the manor in the gathering darkness, the wooden bird clutched safely in her palm. Lady Elspeth realized that the evening had marked both progress and retreat in their complex relationship. He cared for her, that much was now clear beyond doubt. But he also feared that caring for her might bring her harm, and that fear was proving stronger than his desire for the happiness that seemed to lie within their reach. The night held promise, an uncertainty in equal measure, but for the first time since Thomas's death, uncertainty felt like anticipation rather than dread. The broken piece of wax seal lay hidden beneath a loose stone in the stable wall, its red surface cracked but still bearing the unmistakable impression of the royal griffin. Elspeth discovered it purely by accident while searching for Sir Garran's missing glove, her fingers closing around the fragment with a shock of recognition that made her heart race with implications. She was not prepared to accept. She knew that seal. Every noble in the kingdom would recognize the mark that authorized the king's most trusted agents, the men who carried out missions too sensitive for ordinary soldiers. too dangerous for anyone without absolute loyalty to crown and country. The fact that Sir Garran possessed even a fragment of such authority spoke to a past far more significant than she had imagined. Her hands trembled as she examined the broken wax, noting how it had been carefully preserved despite its damaged condition. This was not something a man would keep casually. It represented either the height of honor or the depth of disgrace, depending on how it had come to be separated from its original document. "My lady?" Sir Garran's voice came from the stable entrance, carrying a note of concern that suggested he had noticed her distress. She turned to face him, the seal fragment clutched in her palm, her mind churning with questions that demanded answers despite her growing fear of what those answers might reveal. His pale eyes focused immediately on her closed fist, and she saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of resignation mixed with what might have been relief. "You found it," he said simply, his voice carrying neither surprise nor anger, only the weary acceptance of someone who had always known this moment would come. "The royal seal," she whispered, opening her hand to reveal the damning evidence. "You were one of the king's agents, one of the Shadow Guard." The Shadow Guard, even the name sent chills through the nobility who whispered about them in fearful voices. They were the crown's most elite operatives, men chosen for absolute loyalty and trained in skills that ordinary soldiers never learned. They moved through the kingdom without fanfare or recognition, handling threats that could not be addressed through conventional means. Their existence was officially denied, their identities known only to the king himself and a handful of his most trusted advisors. "I was," he confirmed, his tone carrying neither pride nor shame, only the flat acknowledgement of fact. "For 15 years, I served in that capacity, until circumstances made continued service impossible." She sank onto a nearby hay bale, her legs suddenly unsteady as the implications crashed over her like a tide. What circumstances? What could make the king withdraw his trust from someone who had served so faithfully? Sir Garran moved closer, but did not sit, instead standing before her with the rigid posture of a soldier making a report. When he spoke, his words carried the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this explanation countless times in his own mind. 3 years ago, I was given a mission that required infiltrating a conspiracy among certain lords who were suspected of plotting against the crown. The evidence suggested they were planning to assassinate the king during his visit to the northern provinces, replacing him with a more malleable puppet who would serve their interests. He paused, his pale eyes focusing on something beyond her shoulder, as if looking back through time to events that still caused him pain. "I spent months gaining their trust, becoming part of their inner circle, learning their plans and identifying their resources. But when the time came to reveal their treachery, I discovered that the conspiracy was more complex than anyone had realized. Some of the men I had been ordered to expose were actually double agents, working to uncover the real traitors from within." Elspeth felt her chest tighten as she began to understand the terrible position he had found himself in. "You had to choose between following your orders and protecting innocent men." "I chose to protect the innocent," he said quietly. "But in doing so, I allowed the real conspirators to escape justice. The king's life was saved, but several of his most loyal supporters were killed during the confusion that followed. Men who might have lived if I had acted differently. But surely the king understood that you had prevented a greater tragedy." "The king was never told the truth," Sir Garran interrupted, his voice carrying a bitterness that spoke of betrayals within. "Betrayals? My handler, the man who gave me my orders, was himself part of the conspiracy. When my actions exposed his involvement, he ensured that the official report painted me as a traitor who had warned the conspirators and caused the deaths of loyal men. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. So you were stripped of your position and cast out in disgrace for a crime you did not commit." "Worse than that," he continued, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "A price was placed on my head. Not officially, of course, The shadow guard does not exist, so their failures cannot be acknowledged publicly. But word was spread among certain circles that Sir Garran of Ironhold was a traitor who had betrayed the crown for gold. Bounty hunters and assassins were given my description and told that whoever killed me would be richly rewarded. She stared at him in horror as the full scope of his situation became clear. That's why you maintain silence. Why you cannot reveal your true identity. There are still people hunting you. Some of the conspirators escaped the king's justice and remain at large. They know that I possess information that could expose their continued activities. As long as I remain hidden and silent, they are content to let me live in exile. But if I were to resurface, if I were to attempt to clear my name or resume any position of authority, they would kill you, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. They would kill anyone who stood with me, he corrected grimly. Anyone who offered me shelter or support would become a target. That is why I have remained silent about my past. Why I have accepted being sold at auction like livestock rather than risk bringing danger to innocent people. The truth hit her like a physical blow. This man who had restored hope to her estate, who had brought purpose and joy back into her life, was living under a death sentence. Every day he remained at Dunmere Manor, he was putting her and her people at risk. How long do you think you can hide? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. As long as necessary, he replied. As long as it takes for the remaining conspirators to die of natural causes or for political circumstances, to change enough that my testimony might be welcomed rather than feared. That could be years, decades. Yes, the simple acceptance in. His voice broke her heart. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything, his honor, his identity, his future, to protect others. And he was prepared to continue that sacrifice indefinitely. The wooden bird he had carved, the gentle care he showed to her animals, the quiet competence with which he had rebuilt her estate, all of it was the work of a man trying to find meaning in a life that had been stripped of its original purpose. The others who know the truth, she said suddenly, grasping at possibilities. Surely there are people in the king's service who could testify on your behalf. Most of them are dead, he said bluntly, killed during the conspiracy or eliminated afterward to protect the secret. Those who remain dare not speak for fear of revealing their own involvement in operations that officially never happened. She rose from the hay bale and moved closer to him, her heart aching with the need to offer comfort in the face of such overwhelming injustice. So you carry this burden alone, believing yourself responsible for deaths that were caused by others. Treachery. I carry the burden of my choices, he corrected. Right or wrong, the consequences flow from decisions I made. The guilt is mine to bear. The broken seal fragment seemed to burn in her palm as she looked at this man who had become so dear to her. The revelation of his past explained so much: his careful watchfulness, his reluctance to grow close to others, his insistence that sharing his truth might bring danger. But it also revealed the depth of his honor, the strength of character. That had led him to choose principle over safety, even when the cost was everything he valued. Sir Garran, she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. You saved the king's life and protected innocent men from false accusations. The fact that others twisted your actions into evidence of treason does not diminish the righteousness of what you did. Tell that to the families of the men who died because of my choices, he replied. But she could hear the longing in his voice, the desperate desire to believe that his actions had served justice rather than betraying it. I will tell it to anyone who will listen, she said firmly, her hand moving to cup his cheek as she had seen him do to her. And I will keep telling it until the truth is acknowledged and your name is cleared. The intensity of her declaration seemed to surprise him. Lady Elspeth, you cannot the danger. Let me worry about the danger, she interrupted. You have spent 3 years protecting others at the cost of your own happiness. Perhaps it is time someone protected you. For a moment, she saw something flicker in his pale eyes that might have been hope. But then the familiar caution reasserted itself, and he gently removed her hand from his face. "Your kindness honors me more than you know," he said quietly. "But I will not allow my past to destroy your future. The wisest course is for me to leave Dunmere before my presence brings harm to you and your people." No, the word came out sharper than she had intended, carrying all the force of her growing desperation. "You will not leave. Not when we are finally beginning to understand each other. Not when this estate needs you. Not when I—" She stopped herself before completing the declaration, but the words hung in the air between them as clearly as if she had spoken them aloud. The broken royal seal in her palm seemed to pulse with the weight of secrets revealed and choices that could no longer be avoided. Whatever dangers his past might bring to Dunmere Manor, she was no longer willing to face a future without the man who had become the center of her world. The torn fragment of war banner lay spread across the table in Sir Garran's quarters, its faded blue fabric emblazoned with the silver hawk that had once marked the elite Ironhold regiment. Elspeth traced the embroidered bird with her fingertip, noting how the threads had been worked with the same artistry that marked everything associated with the kingdom's most prestigious military units. "You commanded the Ironhold regiment," she said, her voice carrying wonder mixed with growing understanding of just how far he had fallen from grace. The Ironhold regiment was legendary throughout the kingdom, an elite unit that served as the king's personal guard during times of war and handled the most dangerous missions during peacetime. Sir Garran nodded, his pale eyes focused on the banner fragment with an expression that mixed pride and profound loss. "For 8 years, before I was recruited into the Shadow Guard, those were my men, my brothers in arms. Many of them died, believing I had betrayed everything we stood for together." The weight of that revelation settled over her like a physical presence. To command such a unit required not only exceptional military skill, but also the absolute trust of both superiors and subordinates. The men who served in the Ironhold regiment were volunteers, choosing to follow officers they respected into situations where survival was never guaranteed. "They would have died for you," she said quietly, understanding now why his disgrace had cut so deeply. "Some of them did die for me," he replied, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to display. "During our last mission together, before I was transferred to the Shadow Guard, we were ambushed in the northern passes, outnumbered 3-1 by bandits who had been terrorizing merchant caravans." He moved to the small window that overlooked the estate's eastern fields, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture she recognized as his way of maintaining control when memories threatened to overwhelm him. Sergeant Mills threw himself between me and a crossbow bolt that would have taken my life. Young Davies held a narrow bridge alone against a dozen attackers so the rest of us could reach safety. Captain Harwick fought with a sword through his chest until the last of our enemies fell. The names were spoken with the reverence of a man reciting a prayer for the dead, each one carrying the weight of sacrifice and brotherhood that transcended ordinary loyalty. "They survived that battle," she said, though something in his tone suggested the story did not end with victory. "They survived that battle only to die 3 years later when assassins came looking for their former commander. The men who wanted me dead knew that soldiers like mine never truly abandoned their loyalty to fallen officers. So they eliminated anyone who might have been willing to testify on my behalf or provide me with sanctuary." Elspeth felt the blood drain from her face as the full horror of his situation became clear. "Your own men were murdered because of their connection to you." 17 of them, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Good men with families, with futures ahead of them. Cut down by hired killers who left evidence suggesting I had ordered their deaths to prevent them from revealing my supposed treachery. She moved to stand beside him at the window, her heart breaking for the load of guilt he had been carrying. The careful way he had maintained his silence, his reluctance to form close attachments, his insistence that his presence brought danger, all of it made terrible sense now. "That's why you cannot return to your former life," she said. "Even if you could prove your innocence, the cost in other lives would be too high. The men responsible for framing me have had 3 years to consolidate their positions and eliminate anyone who might pose a threat to their version of events. They control the narrative now, and they have the resources to ensure it remains unchanged." A thought struck her with sudden clarity. But surely the king must have suspicions. The loss of an entire regiment's worth of loyal soldiers, the convenient way evidence appeared to support your guilt. Kings hear what their advisors choose to tell them. Sir Garran replied grimly, "And my former handler, the man who orchestrated my disgrace, rose to become one of the king's most trusted counselors after my supposed treachery was exposed. He has the king's ear and the authority to shape how information reaches the throne." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This was not simply a matter of one man being falsely accused, but of a systematic corruption that reached to the highest levels of government. The forces arrayed against Sir Garran possessed not only the power to destroy individual lives, but to rewrite history itself. "What was his name?" she asked, though she suspected he might not answer. "Your handler, the man who betrayed you." Sir Garran was quiet for so long that she thought he intended to maintain his usual discretion. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a cold hatred that chilled her to the bone. "Lord Commander Alduin Blackthorn, now the King's chief military advisor and head of palace security. The man who decides which threats are worthy of royal attention and which can be handled through unofficial channels." The name meant nothing to her, but the title spoke to the impossibility of Sir Garran's situation. How could a disgraced exile hope to challenge someone who held such authority, who had spent years building an unassailable position within the kingdom's power structure? "There must be someone," she said desperately. "Some person of influence who knew you before, who would recognize the impossibility of the charges against you." "Most of them are dead," he said simply. "Those who survive have learned the wisdom of not questioning official truth too closely. The kingdom has moved on, found new heroes to celebrate and new enemies to fear. Sir Garran of Ironhold is a cautionary tale now, a reminder of how far the mighty can fall when ambition overcomes honor." She wanted to argue, to insist that justice would eventually prevail, but the evidence of his situation spoke against such optimism. He had been systematically isolated from every source of support, cut off from his former life so completely that he might as well have died in truth rather than merely in reputation. "So you plan to remain hidden forever?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from his expression. "I plan to keep those I care about safe," he replied, turning from the window to face her directly, "even if that means accepting a life of exile and obscurity." The way he said, "those I care about," made her heart race with implications that went far beyond the general protection he might feel toward innocent people. She could see in his pale eyes the same growing attachment that had been building in her own heart, the connection that had transformed her impulsive purchase into something approaching love. "And what of your own happiness?" she asked softly. "What of the life you might build if you were free to choose your own path?" "Happiness is a luxury I cannot afford," he said, but his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that suggested his heart disagreed with his words. "The moment I allow myself to hope for more than survival, the moment I begin to believe in possibilities beyond exile, I become vulnerable in ways that could destroy not only me but everyone around me." She moved closer, driven by an impulse stronger than caution or propriety. "What if I told you that some things are worth the risk? That some possibilities are worth fighting for even when the odds seem impossible? I would say that you are braver than wisdom recommends," he replied, echoing their earlier conversations. And I would remind you that courage without understanding of consequences is merely recklessness. Then help me understand, she said, reaching out to take his hands in hers. Tell me exactly what we would be facing if we chose to fight rather than hide. His hands were warm and strong in hers, calloused from honest work, but gentle in their touch. She could feel the slight tremor that ran through him at their contact, evidence that his careful control was not as complete as he pretended. We would be facing enemies with unlimited resources and no scruples about how they achieve their goals, he said quietly. Men who have already proven willing to murder innocent soldiers to protect their secrets. They would not hesitate to destroy a minor estate and everyone on it if they believe such actions served their purposes. But they don't know you're here, she pointed out. Your presence at Dunmere has remained secret. For now, he agreed. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves, especially when those keeping them begin to act differently than expected. If you were to start asking questions about my case, if you were to contact people who might remember the truth about those events, it would not take long for interested parties to trace those inquiries back to their source. The logic was unassailable, but her heart refused to accept the limitations it imposed. So we do nothing? We allow injustice to stand unchallenged because fighting it might be dangerous. We protect what we can protect, he said firmly. We preserve what is good and valuable in our current situation, rather than risking everything on the chance that past wrongs might be corrected. She understood his position, even sympathized with the wisdom behind it. But the growing certainty of her feelings for him made acceptance of permanent exile seem like a form of death in itself. The man who had restored hope to her estate, who had brought joy and purpose back into her life, deserved better than a future of hiding and self-denial. Sir Garran, she said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. What if I told you that I love you? Would that change your calculations about what risks are worth taking? The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. She saw him go very still, his pale eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether she truly understood what she was saying. It would make the risks even less acceptable, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, because it would mean that my choices could destroy not only your life, but your happiness. And what if I told you that I would rather face any danger at your side than live safely without you? She pressed. What if I said that your happiness has become as important to me as my own? She could see the war being fought behind his eyes, the battle between desire and duty that had been tearing him apart since the day of his arrival. His hands tightened on hers, and for a moment she thought he might surrender to the feelings she could read so clearly in his expression. But then, as always, caution reasserted itself. He gently extracted his hands from hers and stepped back, putting physical distance between them that felt like an emotional wall. Your feelings honor me more than you know, he said quietly. But they also make it more important than ever that I protect you from the consequences of my past. Love should not be repaid with danger. Love should not be denied because of fear, she countered, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. The torn banner fragment on the table seemed to pulse with the weight of history and sacrifice, a reminder of the price that honor sometimes demanded. But as she looked at this man who had given up everything to protect others, who continued to deny himself happiness for the same noble purpose, Lady Elspeth realized that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The forces that had destroyed his former life might be powerful, but they had not reckoned with the determination of a woman who had finally found something worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight she was content to know that her feelings were not unrequited, even if they remained unacknowledged. The war banner had once marked men who fought for honor and loyalty. Perhaps it was time for those same values to be defended by those who understood their true worth. The black raven feather lay on her pillow like a silent threat. its dark surface gleaming in the morning light that streamed through her chamber window. Elspeth stared at it with growing dread, understanding instinctively that its presence meant the peaceful interlude at Dunmere Manor was about to end. No natural bird had left this calling card. It had been placed there deliberately by someone who wanted her to know that Sir Garran's enemies had found him. Her hands trembled as she lifted the feather, noting its perfect condition and the way. It had been positioned precisely in the center of her pillow. Whoever had entered her private chambers had done so with the silent skill of a professional, leaving no other trace of their presence beyond this ominous message. The violation of her sanctuary sent chills through her that had nothing to do with the morning air. A soft knock at her door made her heart leap with alarm. "My lady?" Martha's voice carried concern that suggested the cook had noticed something amiss. "Sir Garran wishes to speak with you urgently. He's waiting in the stable yard." Elspeth wrapped the cloak around her shoulders and hurried downstairs. The raven feather clutched in her palm like evidence of a crime she could not yet fully comprehend. She found Sir Garran standing beside his donkey, his posture rigid with the kind of alertness she had learned to associate with imminent danger. His pale eyes swept the estate's perimeter with systematic thoroughness, as if cataloging potential threats and escape routes. "They found me," he said without preamble when she approached. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had been expecting this moment for 3 years. "My former handler's agents were here during the night. They wanted me to know they could reach me whenever they chose." She held out the black feather, watching his expression tighten as he recognized its significance. "They were in my chambers, in my private rooms while I slept." "A warning," he said grimly, taking the feather and examining it with professional attention. "They want me to understand that no place is safe, that even the people I try to protect can be reached at will." The implications struck her like physical blows. Not content with finding his location, his enemies had chosen to demonstrate their power by violating the most private spaces of someone under his protection. It was psychological, warfare of the cruelest kind, designed to make him feel helpless and isolated even when surrounded by people who cared for him. "What do they want?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would offer little comfort. "My silence, permanently insured," he replied, his hands checking weapons she had not realized he carried. "They cannot afford to have me alive while political. Situations remain fluid. Too many things could change. Too many people could come forward. Too many secrets could be revealed if I were ever given the opportunity to tell my story to the right audience." She felt a chill that went deeper than fear for her own safety. "They mean to kill you. They mean to eliminate a loose thread that could unravel carefully constructed lies," he corrected. "My death will be arranged to look like the work of common bandits, or perhaps an accident that befalls a man living rough in the countryside. No one will investigate too deeply, and my enemies will be free to continue their work without concern." The matter-of-fact way he discussed his own murder made her want to scream with frustration and terror. How could he remain so calm when discussing something so horrible? How could he accept such an outcome as if it were merely an unpleasant inevitability? "We have to run," she said desperately. "Leave Dunmere immediately. Find somewhere they cannot follow." "There is nowhere they cannot follow," he replied gently. "Lord Commander Blackthorne has resources throughout the kingdom. He can call upon agents, informants, and assassins in every major city and most remote settlements. Running would only delay the inevitable while ensuring that you became a target as well." "Then we fight," she said, her voice carrying a determination that surprised them both. "We gather what allies we can and make a stand." Sir Garran's expression softened at her words, a mixture of admiration and heartbreak crossing his features. "My brave lady, what allies could we possibly gather? Henrik is a loyal man but past his fighting years. Tom has courage but no combat training. Martha would defend you with her life but lacks the skills for this kind of warfare. There are other estates, other lords who have heard the official version of my disgrace and would be more likely to turn me over to the authorities than provide sanctuary," he interrupted. "The story of my supposed treachery has been spread widely and carefully reinforced. Most nobles would see harboring me as an act of rebellion against the crown." She wanted to argue, to insist that justice and truth would eventually prevail, but the evidence of their situation argued against such optimism. The raven feather in her palm seemed to pulse with the weight of forces too powerful to resist, enemies too entrenched to defeat through conventional means. "So, what do you propose?" she asked, though she dreaded hearing his answer. "I propose to leave Dunmere immediately, before my continued presence brings further danger to you and your people," he said quietly. "If I disappear into the countryside, they will follow me rather than threatening innocent people who showed me kindness." "No." The word came out with such force that his donkey's ears twitched in alarm. "I will not allow you to sacrifice yourself to protect me. We face this together or not at all." "Lady Elspeth, you cannot." "I can and I will," she interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "This estate has weathered attacks before. These walls have stood against enemies who thought they could take what did not belong to them. If Lord Commander Blackthorn wants to add murder to his list of crimes, he will find that Dunmere Manor is not as defenseless as he assumes." Sir Garran stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time, his pale eyes reflecting wonder, mixed with terror at her determination. "You do not understand what you are proposing. These are not common bandits or neighboring lords squabbling over boundary disputes. These are professional killers backed by royal authority and unlimited resources." "Then we will have to be cleverer than they are," she replied, her mind already working through possibilities that seemed impossible, but not quite hopeless. "You were trained by the same people who taught them. You know their methods and their weaknesses. Surely that knowledge can be turned to our advantage." For a moment, she saw something flicker in his expression that might have been hope struggling against despair. But then the familiar caution reasserted itself, and he shook his head with the sadness of a man who had learned not to believe in victories. "Knowledge is not enough against overwhelming odds," he said gently. "Courage is admirable, but cannot stop crossbow bolts or poisoned daggers. You would be asking me to gamble with your life on the slim chance that we might somehow prevail against enemies who've had years to prepare for this confrontation. You would be asking me to live with the knowledge that I abandoned the man I love when he needed me most," she replied, her heart racing at the admission she had finally spoken aloud. "That is a gamble I am not willing to take." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. She could see the impact they had on him, the way they cut through his careful defenses and struck at the heart he had been trying so hard to protect. When he looked at her now, she could see love and longing warring with duty and despair. "If we do this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, "if we choose to fight rather than flee, there may be no retreat. Once we commit to this path, we will be enemies of powerful people who do not forgive and do not forget." "Then we had better make sure we win," she replied, stepping closer until she could feel the warmth of his breath against her face. "Because I refuse to lose you now that I have finally found you." The black raven feather seemed to burn in her palm, but for the first time since discovering it, the threat it represented felt like a challenge rather than a death sentence. Tomorrow would bring whatever forces Lord Commander Blackthorn chose to send against them. But today, they would prepare for a battle that would determine not only their survival, but their right to choose their own destiny. The ancient shield bore the weathered crest of House Garran, silver wolf beneath 3 stars that had once marked one of the kingdom's most honored families. Sir Garran held it with reverent care as he explained its significance to the small group gathered in Dunmere's main hall. his voice carrying pride mixed with sorrow for a heritage that had been stripped away by treachery and lies. "My father carried this shield when he served as the king's champion," he said, running his fingers along the dented metal surface that spoke of battles fought with honor and courage. His father before him bore it in the border wars, and his grandfather held it during the siege of Ravenscroft. It has protected my family through 7 generations of service to the crown. Elspeth watched the faces of her small household as they listened to their protector reveal truths that transformed him from mysterious stranger to exiled nobleman. Martha's eyes were wide with understanding. Henrik nodded with the satisfaction of a man whose instincts about character had been proven correct. And young Tom seemed awed by the realization that he had been working alongside someone of such distinguished lineage. "The wolf represents loyalty," Sir Garran continued, his pale eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "The stars represent the 3 virtues that guide honorable action: courage, wisdom, and justice. These symbols have meaning only if those who bear them are willing to live and die by the principles they represent." "And you have lived by those principles," Elspeth said firmly, her voice carrying absolute conviction. "Everything I have observed tells me that your honor remains intact despite the lies that have been spread about your past." The shield seemed to pulse with ancestral power as Sir Garran detailed the preparations they would need to make for the coming confrontation. Lord Commander Blackthorn's agents would not approach openly. They preferred to work in shadows, using methods that allowed their actions to be dismissed as accidents or the work of common criminals. "They will come at night," he explained, moving to the hall's large windows to study the approaches to the manor. "Probably tomorrow, when the moon is dark, and their movement will be harder to detect. They will seek to eliminate me quietly, making it appear that I died resisting bandits who attacked the estate." "How many?" Henrik asked, his weathered hands checking the crossbow he had retrieved from the estate's small armory. "No more than 6, Sir Garran replied. "Enough to overwhelm what they assume is minimal resistance, but not so many that their presence risks discovery by neighboring estates. Blackthorn prefers efficiency to overwhelming force when secrecy is required." Elspeth felt her stomach tighten at the thought of armed killers creeping through the darkness toward people she cared about. But alongside the fear came a fierce determination to protect what had become precious to her. This estate, these people, and most especially the man who had restored meaning to her life. "What advantages do we have?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself despite the circumstances. "We know they are coming," Sir Garran said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of a military commander planning a campaign. "We know their methods and their likely approach routes. Most importantly, we are defending our home while they are operating on unfamiliar ground." The next several hours were spent in detailed preparation that transformed Dunmere Manor from a peaceful estate into a carefully planned defensive position. Sir Garran revealed knowledge of tactics and fortification that spoke to his extensive military training, while the household staff proved surprisingly adaptable to their new roles as defenders rather than servants. Martha took charge of preparing supplies and medical materials, her practical nature finding expression in ensuring that food, water, and healing herbs would be readily available throughout the night. Tom eagerly accepted instruction in the use of crossbow and sword, his youthful enthusiasm balanced by Sir Garran's careful attention to proper technique and safety. Henrik, despite his age and arthritis, proved invaluable in identifying the estate's defensive advantages and potential vulnerabilities. His decades of maintaining the grounds had given him intimate knowledge of every path, gate, and blind spot that might be exploited by attackers or defenders. But it was Elspeth who surprised everyone, including herself, with her quick grasp of strategic thinking and her willingness to take an active role in the coming battle. When Sir Garran initially suggested that she remain in the manor's most secure room while the fighting took place, She responded with a look that brooked no argument. "This is my estate," she said firmly. "These are my people you are asking to risk their lives. I will not cower in safety while others face danger on my behalf. Lady Elspeth, the risks are risks I choose to accept," she interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. "I can handle a crossbow as well as any of you, and I know this estate better than any attacker ever could. My place is beside you, not hiding in some secure chamber waiting to learn whether the people I love have survived." The word love hung in the air between them, no longer hidden behind careful courtesy or social convention. She could see its impact on Sir Garran's expression, the way it strengthened his resolve while simultaneously increasing his terror at the thought of losing her daughter as evening approached. They made their final preparations with the efficiency of people who understood that survival depended on attention to detail. Crossbows were positioned at strategic windows, weapons were checked and rechecked, and signals were established for communication in the darkness. Sir Garran took Elspeth aside as the sun set behind the western hills, his ancient shield strapped to his arm and his restored sword hanging at his side. In the fading light, he looked every inch the noble knight his lineage proclaimed him to be, but she could see the weight of responsibility in his pale eyes. "If something happens to me tonight," he began, but she silenced him with a look. "Nothing will happen to you," she said with fierce certainty. "We will face whatever comes together, and we will prevail because we have something worth fighting for." "And what is that?" he asked, though she could see in his expression that he already knew the answer. "Each other," she replied simply. "Our right to choose our own destiny, rather than accepting the fate others would impose upon us. The chance to build something good and lasting in defiance of those who profit from corruption and lies." He reached out to cup her face in his calloused hands, his touch gentle despite the strength she could feel in his fingers. "You are braver than any knight I have ever known," he said softly. "Stronger than any warrior who ever carried my family's shield." "Then we are well matched," she replied, covering his hands with her own. "And whatever happens tonight, I want you to know that I have never regretted the decision to buy a mysterious knight and his donkey at a country auction." His laugh was soft but genuine, carrying warmth that pushed back against the growing darkness. "Nor have I ever been more grateful to be purchased by an eccentric lady with a generous heart and questionable judgment." As night fell over Dunmere Manor, they took their positions with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the coming hours would determine not only their survival, but the right to love freely in a world that seemed determined to destroy anyone who dared to choose honor over expedience. The ancient shield gleamed in the moonlight, a symbol of family heritage that had endured through generations of conflict. Tonight, it would either protect the last bearer of his noble name or become a monument to the final defeat of a bloodline that had served the kingdom with distinction for centuries. But as Sir Garran settled into position with his crossbow trained on the manor's main approach, he felt something he had not experienced in 3 years of exile, hoped that justice might still be possible, that love might prove stronger than political corruption, that honor might yet triumph over the forces arrayed against it. The bloodstained letter that would change everything lay hidden in Sir Garran's personal effects, its parchment yellow with age, and its contents written in the shaking hand of a dying man. But that discovery would come later, after the battle that began with shadows moving against shadows in the darkness surrounding Dunmere Manor. They came as Sir Garran had predicted, 6 figures moving with professional silence through the estate's grounds, their dark clothing making them nearly invisible against the night sky. Elspeth caught the first glimpse of movement from her position at the manor's upper window, her heart racing as she realized that the theoretical threat had become deadly reality. The attackers moved with the coordinated precision of men who had worked together before, splitting into 2 groups to approach the manor from different angles. Their leader, A tall figure with the bearing of someone accustomed to command directed his companions with hand signals that spoke of military training and extensive experience in this kind of work. Sir Garran's response was immediate and decisive. The months of peaceful estate work had not dulled his warrior's instincts, and he moved through the manor's defenses with the fluid grace of someone whose body remembered lessons learned through years of combat. His crossbow sang in the darkness, the first bolt taking down the assassin who had been creeping toward the kitchen entrance where Martha waited with her own weapon. The battle that followed was brief but intense, a deadly dance between professionals who understood that survival depended on speed, accuracy, and the willingness to kill without hesitation. But Lord Commander Blackthorn's agents had made a crucial miscalculation. They had expected to face a broken exile and a handful of helpless servants, not a coordinated defense led by someone who still possessed all the skills that had once made him the kingdom's most feared operative. Henrik's crossbow bolt caught the second attacker as he tried to scale the manor's wall, while Tom proved that youthful enthusiasm could compensate for a lack of experience when properly directed. Even Martha contributed to the defense, using her knowledge of the manor's layout to guide their movements and provide support where needed. But it was Elspeth who provided the decisive moment, her own crossbow finding its mark just as one of the assassins broke through their perimeter and threatened to reach Sir Garran's exposed flank. Her shout was true, driven by desperation and love, and the attacker fell mere steps from his intended target. When the violence ended and the last of their enemies lay still in Dunmer's courtyard, Sir Garran found himself staring at evidence he had never expected to see again. One of the fallen assassins carried papers that identified him as an agent of Lord Commander Blackthorn, along with written orders that detailed not only the mission to eliminate Sir Garran, but also the broader conspiracy that had led to his disgrace. "This changes everything," he said, his voice thick with emotions he could barely contain as he examined documents that provided proof of his innocence. These orders referenced the original conspiracy, named the real traitors, even admit that my actions saved the king's life rather than threatening it. Elspeth moved to his side, her own hands shaking from the aftermath of violence, but her voice steady with growing hope. "Does this mean you can clear your name? Can you finally tell the world the truth about what really happened?" "More than that," he replied, his pale eyes reflecting wonder at the turn of fate that had brought vindication through violence. "This evidence implicates Lord Commander Blackthorn directly in the conspiracy he claimed to be investigating. It proves that he was the architect of the entire plot, that he used his position to frame me when I threatened to expose his treachery. The blood-stained letter that would seal Blackthorn's fate was discovered in the assassin leader's personal effects, a final message from the dying soldier who had originally uncovered the conspiracy, addressed to Sir Garran and providing testimony that would be impossible to discredit or dismiss. The letter had been kept as insurance by men who understood that their own survival might eventually depend on having evidence against their employer. As dawn broke over Dunmer Manor, painting the estate's stones in shades of gold and rose that seemed to promise hope after darkness, Sir Garran found himself faced with possibilities he had not dared to imagine for 3 years. The evidence in his hands was sufficient not only to clear his name, but to expose the corruption that had nearly destroyed the kingdom from within. "What happens now?" Elspeth asked, her hand finding his as they stood together in the courtyard where they had fought for their right to choose their own destiny. "Now we take this evidence to people who can act upon it," he replied, his voice carrying new strength and purpose. "The king must be told the truth, regardless of how painful that truth might be. Justice delayed is still justice, and honor demands that we see this through to its proper conclusion." The weeks that followed brought vindication beyond anything Sir Garran had dared to hope. Lord Commander Blackthorn's arrest sent shockwaves through the kingdom's power structure, while the revelation of his crimes led to a systematic review of other cases where his influence might have perverted justice. Sir Garran's name was not only cleared but honored, his service to the crown officially recognized, and his noble title formally restored. But perhaps more importantly, the experience had forged bonds that transcended social rank or political convenience. The household that had defended Dunmere Manor together remained united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Martha continued to rule the kitchen with benevolent authority. Henrik maintained the grounds with renewed vigor, and Tom grew into a man worthy of the trust that had been placed in him during their darkest hour. The 2 wedding rings that gleamed on Elspeth's finger 6 months later represented more than the union of 2 people who had found love in unexpected circumstances. They symbolized the triumph of honor over corruption, the power of courage to overcome seemingly impossible odds, and the truth that some battles are worth fighting regardless of their cost. Sir Garran of Ironhold, Knight Commander of the Restored Royal Guard and husband to Lady Elspeth of Dunmere, stood once again in service to his king. But now he served with the knowledge that true loyalty sometimes required the courage to question authority rather than blindly obeying it. His restored sword hung at his side, not as a symbol of unthinking obedience, but as a reminder that honor demanded the strength to protect what was right even when doing so required sacrifice. Dunmere Manor flourished under their joint stewardship, its grounds restored to their former beauty, and its halls once again filled with laughter and purpose. The estate became known throughout the kingdom as a place where honor was valued above expedience, where loyalty was earned rather than demanded, and where 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds proved that love could indeed triumph over the forces arrayed against it. The ancient oak tree that had sheltered their growing understanding continued to spread its branches over grounds that had been watered with blood but now bloomed with hope. Its deep roots anchored not only the tree itself, but the legacy of courage and devotion that would inspire future generations to believe that sometimes the most broken people do indeed find each other when they need it most, and that what begins as a joke can become the greatest treasure of a lifetime. In the quiet evenings when they walked the estate together, Elspeth would sometimes catch her husband carving small wooden birds with the same gentle artistry that had first revealed his hidden depths. The carvings were gifts now, tokens of affection freely given rather than artifacts of solitary exile. But they retained the same delicate beauty that spoke of a soul that could create as well as protect. And in the stables where their story had truly begun, a patient donkey grazed contentedly in paddocks that had been repaired by hands that no longer worked in secret shame but in open pride. The simple animal had witnessed the transformation of a broken knight into a man restored, a lonely widow into a beloved wife, and a failing estate into a thriving testament to the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Their story became legend in time, told around firesides and in taverns throughout the kingdom. The tale of a woman who bought a knight at auction as a jest and discovered that he was everything she had never dared to hope for. But those who knew them personally understood that the real magic lay not in the dramatic moments of revelation and battle, but in the quiet daily choices to trust, to hope, to believe that tomorrow could be better than yesterday if people were willing to work together towards something greater than themselves. The jest had become a love story. The purchase had become a partnership, and the broken had indeed found healing in each other's arms.